welcome to the first 2021 pre-conference session of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. My name is Prema Kurien, and I'm the current president of PRRI. Our panel today is titled American Christianity and the Legacy of White Supremacy. And it'll feature presentations and a conversation among three eminent scholars of religion who have each recently written or published a cutting-edge book on white American Christianity and its racial legacy. And I'm sure you'll all agree that this panel is very timely. And I'm delighted to see that this is so well attended. I know that we had a very large number of people who pre-registered. Hopefully, most of you are here now. So I decided to organize these pre-conference sessions since we unfortunately had to cancel our meetings this past October. And I know that many people were really upset and missed having the chance to hear about new work in the field and to participate in the discussions around research in the field. So we have three pre-conference sessions. We just added one recently for March. And I'll talk about that in just a bit, and we will have information on our website. And they're all tied to the conference theme for this year, which is Global and Comparative Perspectives on Religion. So I chose this theme to encourage all of us to think of our work in global and comparative perspectives, even if our particular research is located within one country and one group and one faith tradition. So this panel will provide a comparative perspective on white Christianity. So our next panel is going to be on Friday, March 12th. Please make a note, same time, 2:30. And I know that it's one that many of you will be interested in. This is to talk about a new Pew Research study that is titled Faith Among Black Americans. It looks at a wide range of religious experiences and institutions and a wide range of Black groups, including Black immigrants. Our third panel is on Friday, April 9th, again, at 2:30. And that one will showcase the global links and the transnational connections of religions that are actually now based in the US, and, from white and Black Christianity to African immigrant traditions, and Islam and Hinduism in South Asia. So let me tell you about the format of this panel. Each panelist will take 15 minutes to talk about the main arguments in their book, and then we will open up the session for discussion and questions from all of you. So we will go in this order: Dr. Robert Jones, next Dr. Anthea Butler, and then Dr. Khyati Joshi. So I will introduce each of them just before their presentation. So I will start with a very brief introduction for Dr. Robert Jones. Dr. Robert P. Jones is the CEO and founder of PRRI, which is the Public Religion Research Institute. And he's a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He is the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, and The End of White Christian America. He has a PhD in religion from Emory University. Thank you, please go ahead.
Great, I'm gonna share my screen here. Great. Well, thank you so much, Prema. I'm really glad to be here. I'm sure, like everyone else on the panel, is sad that we are all in our little boxes on the screen and not in a room together where we could have a kind of more extended conversation. But I'm also happy that it probably means there are some people who are here that would not have been able to make it to a physical in-person conference. So I'm happy that we have got kind of a broader conversation in that sense. So I'm going to take just a little bit to kind of walk through some of the main arguments of my recent book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. And since I'm with a bunch of social scientists, I'm going to highlight and kind of concentrate on the data portion of the book. So the book is written for a popular audience. There's really only one chapter that's got a deep dive on the data, and it's kind of one part of a three-legged stool. The other piece for the book is historical, a fair amount of historical spade work looking at this legacy of how white supremacy has been embedded in the DNA of American Christianity in particular. And then the other piece, which is a little bit new for me, and I'm going to return to it at the very end of my comments, is this book's also a little bit of memoir, which I've never written before. And it had to do with the fact that there was really no way for me to write this story without putting myself in it as someone who grew up in the Deep South as a Southern Baptist in Mississippi and with family roots that go back 6 generations into Middle Georgia. So really blending kind of my own personal family story with scholarship was something of a new endeavor for me in this book, but one that I thought was really the only honest way really to write the book. But in this, I'm going to concentrate really on kind of what I found, because the history really sets the stage for things that have been kind of swept under the rug or are really not held up as to, when everyone thinks of, if you say white supremacy and church, what most people think of is African American churches, which were the places of courageous stands and organizing against white supremacy and civil rights. What very few think of are white churches, when you do that word association, who were sites of massive resistance to Black equality and massive supporters of white supremacy. And what I'm going to show you today is really kind of my attempt to say, well, okay, there is that history. How is that still with us today, and how might we understand, where the strength of it, and in particular, how it is still with us, not just among white evangelicals, but among white mainline Protestants, white Catholics, across the kind of white Christian spectrum, and how does it look different from whites who are religiously unaffiliated as well? So in other words, kind of looking at the work that Christianity is doing among white Americans on this issue. So I'm going to just jump right in with a couple of example questions. So in the book, I use a scale. I create a scale out of 15 different questions that have to do with systemic racism, race in America, and I'll talk about more of that in a minute. But I want to give you just a couple of concrete questions so I don't jump into the abstract first. So this is a question that has been used on the CCES, the GSS, other places. We've asked it at PRRI a number of times, but this is the percentage of people who disagree. Generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Blacks to work their way out of the middle class. And this pattern that we see on this question is one that showed up over and over and over again. Whenever I looked at questions that particularly had to do with systemic racism and whether it existed or not in the country. So the pattern you'll see here is one I'll show in a number of slides. 3 main large white Christian groups. I should also say these are white non-Hispanic groups in the analysis. So white evangelicals showing up the most likely to disagree with this statement, but white mainline Protestants, white Catholics showing up just underneath those numbers at slightly lower. And then, as typical, a nearly 20-point difference, sometimes it's a little more than that actually, between these white Christian groups and white religiously unaffiliated Americans, on the other hand, who are much less likely to disagree with this. And then I've got African American Protestants up here as a kind of reference group as well. So you can see the kind of distance between white Christian groups and African American Protestants as well. Another question shows very similar patterns. Questions about Confederate monuments or Confederate flags. This is the proportion of people who say that these are more a symbol of Southern pride than a symbol of racism. So flags in the darker color, monuments in the lighter green here. Again, pretty similar patterns. White evangelicals most likely to say they're more a symbol of Southern pride, but white mainline, white Catholics right behind them really. And then a big drop off, in this case is 30 percentage points approximately for whites who claim no religious affiliation, and then African American Protestants lower than that. So again, the same pattern that you see here. And then finally, on another individual question that's part of this larger index, when we asked about this question that's been, in the headlines, for the last 5 years, but in particular since the killing of George Floyd last spring, these are people who perceive the killing of unarmed African Americans by police to be isolated incidents rather than part of a pattern. So again, a kind of denial of systemic racism here in the country. And again, white evangelical Protestants, 70% see them as isolated incidents. White mainline, white Catholics right behind there. Here are white unaffiliated, again, a good 30 percentage points below, and then African-American Protestants below that. So I built all of this with 15 other questions into an index, and then standardized the index between 0 and 1 that I called the racism index in the book. And what was remarkable is that across all 15 of these questions that were highly, highly correlated, the Cronbach's alpha on that scale was 0.91. For those of you keeping score on those sorts of technical measures. And here's the distribution here with these kind of white lines are median lines. And you basically see the same pattern, right? That across these 15 questions on a scale of 0 to 1, white evangelicals come out around 0.8, white mainline Protestants and white Catholics both right around 0.7, and then white religiously unaffiliated Americans, again, down around 0.4. You can also see the difference in the shapes of the distributions here. That also kind of tells you something about kind of the kind of weight across these 15 different questions. The other thing I did, of course, in the book is to try to look and see, okay, that's a correlation between these things, but what happens if you put it into a model and you introduce a fair number of controls? I threw in a control for party, education, region, age, gender, income, church attendance, metro versus rural, and even attitudes on immigration, because I wanted to make sure that attitudes on race weren't getting conflated with attitudes on immigration. It's remarkable, even with all of those controls in, that the independent relationship between holding these more racist attitudes and identifying as one of these white Christian subgroups really stands up. In fact, the main effect of introducing controls into the model was to equalize the relationship across the different white Christian subgroups. In other words, once we controlled, particularly for partisanship, white evangelical Protestant scores came down a bit, but they basically equalized with white mainline and white Catholic. This chart is really the predicted probability of what happens when you move from the low end of the racism index to the high end of the racism index. So moving from 0 to 1 on that score, from holding the least racist attitudes to holding most racist attitudes, which direction does the likelihood of identifying as white and Christian go? And as you'll see, it basically goes up. The predicted probability rises about 20 percentage points across each of these groups. And for white religiously unaffiliated, it basically has no effect. It's a very small effect. It's actually in the negative direction there. So this basically tells you that even when controls in place, there is this positive relationship between holding more racist attitudes and identifying as white and Christian. The other piece I try to take a harder look at too is with church attendance. What difference does church attendance make across the board among white Christians as a whole? I mean, it basically makes no difference at all. Because I was going to check about this kind of Christian in name only concern, and it turns out but among white evangelicals, the relationship between holding kind of more racist attitudes on this racism index and identifying as a white evangelical is actually stronger among frequent church attenders than it is among less frequent church attenders. You can kind of see in this chart as well. So in other words, there's no evidence that attending church at higher levels plays any mitigating role in holding more racist attitudes among white Christians as a whole. And among white evangelicals, not only does it not hold a mitigating role, but the relationship is actually stronger among those who attend more frequently. Last here, I want to just kind of jump. So that's from the book. And I want to jump to just a couple of things that I saw in the exit polls that I think are worth noting, that I think gets to the power of attitudes around race, in particularly in our current political moment. These are from the National Exit Poll, National Election Pool exit polls. And they asked these several questions about like whether you have a favorable view of Black Lives Matter, unfavorable. These are unfavorable views, whether you thought the criminal justice system treats all people fairly. These are people who agree with that statement. And whether racism in the US is a problem. These are people who say it's either a minor problem or no problem. And there's this remarkable correlation between basically having a negative view of Black Lives Matter or not seeing racism as a problem, either in criminal justice or in general, and support for Trump. And in fact, this correlation was actually stronger than the correlation on abortion. In the exit polls, the split on abortion is about a 75-25 split. So if you, in other words, if you think abortion should be illegal in all or most cases, you're about 75% likely, 75% of those people voted for Trump. But here it's actually above 80%. And just one more thing to kind of put this here, if I drop in just the racism index scores on top of the voting habit, the voting patterns, I'm actually switching here to the AP VoteCast exit poll because I was able to get full religion breaks from there, more detailed religion breaks than I was in the NEP exit poll. But you can see that the correlations here are quite strong between just the racism index and vote for President Trump there. So I'm going to wrap up with just a couple of comments, kind of go back from the personal here. You know, this is certainly a very personal book. And since we're at a guild where we're, I'm among kind of colleagues, social scientists, both quantitative, qualitative, and probably others, historians and others. I just want to say that, I think we have a real opportunity and real mandate really to kind of use the tools of our guild to really begin uncovering more of this research, and we're really only at the beginning of it. And I think this is a particular imperative for those of us who either study, as our primary thing, white Christian institutions, or for those of us who are at white Christian institutions as well. These stories are only beginning to be told historically. The data, I think, has really only begun to be analyzed in a systematic way. I think there's a lot more work to do here. And so, if we're going to really understand the image that I had for my own kind of studying my own family and history in the book was this image of white supremacy really like kudzu kind of creeping down through the family tree and through the institutional histories. And if we're finally going to prune it, I think from in our midst here, and I think it's one of the biggest challenges to democracy that we face, and in fact one of the biggest challenges to our churches that we face. If we're going to be the generation that finally prunes that from our midst, I think it's going to take not only our personal efforts, but our professional efforts, and bringing the lenses from our professional work to really help do that work so that we, as we go through and we think about the institutions that, we're going to hand down to our children and to our students, those who are teaching, that, we've got a responsibility, I think, to kind of take this up. Really, and again, finally hand down some healthier institutions than the ones that we inherited. So I will end it there with that appeal.
Thank you so much. When I contacted Dr. Jones to present, I told him that I had read his book and I was just absolutely devastated by the implications of, what he found. So, thank you for that. So next we have Dr. Anthea Butler. She's Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. A historian of African American and American religion, Professor Butler's research and writing spans African American religion and history, race, politics, evangelicalism, gender and sexuality, media, and popular culture. Her books include Women in the Church of God in Christ, Making a Sanctified World, and the brand new White Evangelical Racism, the Politics of Morality in America, that's coming out later this month. So it's brand new. She has a PhD in religion from Vanderbilt University.
Thank you so much, Prema. Thank you all for having me. I'm going to share my screen as well. This is the book. It will be out on March 22nd. The audio book will be out in April. And I want to thank all of you for being here because this is a topic that I think is really important. And you're probably wondering, why is a historian here at SSR? Well, I've been to SSR before. My minor is in sociology, but there's no numbers here. And I think Robert Jones just set it up very well for me to come in and tell you about why I did the book that I did and why this is so important for us right now. So I'm only going to show a few slides, but I want to talk about setting this up and what made me want to do this book. What made me want to do this book is a couple of things. I've been writing in the public for a while about race and evangelicalism and religion. And one of the things that struck me is that every time that somebody wanted to talk about what happened with evangelicals in the Trump era, it was almost as though evangelicals were this pristine group. They were a group that had never been racist before. They had never done anything wrong. And so what really set me off was this particular piece from The Atlantic. And this was back a few years ago, April 2018, of Michael Gerson's How Evangelicals Lost Their Way and Got Hooked by Donald Trump. And one of my friends, Michael Papard, said how white evangelicals lost their way and got hooked by Donald Trump. And I think that actually says it all, because Gerson's piece was a history about evangelicalism. It was a history that was about abolitionism and missionary work and the greatness of Billy Graham and how he saved so many people and how Billy Graham, talked to presidents and everything. And it was this really just, engaging piece that evangelicals had never done anything wrong. They'd never done anything bad. And I was just like, I'm a historian and I teach African-American religious history and American religious history, and I know this is wrong. And so the premise of my book is simply this: how have evangelicals hidden behind moral issues in order to achieve power and strength in the political realm? First, a little bit with the Democratic Party, but then mostly with the Republican Party. And secondarily, how long have they been racist? Well, folks, they've been racist since the beginning of this country. And what my book does is to take a look from the 19th century to the 21st to talk about racism. So I want to talk about the first part of the book with Gerson sitting here, and then I'm going to talk about the second part of the book and show you just a couple of slides. So I really started off with the premise here. Gerson in his article says, this is really sad, and how evangelicals lost their way, and that somehow they got tainted. And I thought that he would not look at the thing that evangelicals never look at, their whiteness. They never look at the whiteness of the movement. They never understand that the whiteness of the cultural parts of the movement, whether we're talking about music, behavior, dress, and everything else, has a sense in which it draws people in a different kind of way. So what I wanted to do was to show not just evangelicals, but everybody else, the thing that has been bothering everybody all this time. How is it that they have gone this way and don't see the racism in their groups? And the first chapter after the introduction starts off with a story that is a present day story with the Christian gospel singer, again, sort of rap, Lecrae, and his meeting with Dan Khyati and another big, basically, I would say mega church pastor in Atlanta. And basically at that meeting, the megachurch pastor said, well, slavery was a gift to white people. I'm paraphrasing. And everybody lost their minds. Lecrae tried to talk about this, but it ended up being an embarrassing moment for which this evangelical Black Christian artist was trapped between two older white men who basically set him up for this particular thing. And I opened that chapter out about slavery to talk about the ways in which people talked about slavery and enslavement of African Americans through their use of the Bible, through scriptural admonitions, through books that they have written about slavery, and extolling the reasons why Christianity was important in A, keeping slaves, and B, keeping white men in power. Obviously, some of this fell apart with the Civil War. And in the post-Civil War era, I talk about the religion of the lost cause and how that religion of the lost cause merged with churches in order to set this up as a bulwark. So if you would read Robbie and I's book together, you would see that this history kind of messaged in a certain kind of way. And the ways in which white evangelicals thought about their religion in the latter half of the 19th century was that it was here in order to give morality, to give law and order for African Americans who had been newly freed from slavery, but to also establish that white men were the leaders, not just in churches, but in everyday life. And the ways in which white women supported this was through the ways in which white women were placed on a pedestal in the 19th century and the post-Civil War era, and to be set as pure. So these ideas of purity and morality come into play when you're juxtaposing this against African-American men and African-American women who were seen to be loose and all of these kinds of other pejorative things. In the second chapter, and I'm just going to kind of go through this very quickly, what I take a look at is the beginnings of, the modern day evangelical movement in the 1940s and 50s. And what I spent a lot of time on is basically Billy Graham. And Billy Graham is the fulcrum. He is the foundation for everything that we think about that has happened in relationships with evangelicals and presidents. And I think one of the things that's important to understand about Billy Graham is that he's not just a gradualist. He really doesn't want to have equality. And I think that the ways in which people have portrayed him with pictures of him and King for that one particular time belies the relationship that they had, which was a very strained one. I think people don't remember the manners in which he spoke about the March on Washington after it happened, where he basically poo-pooed the whole thing, where he's asked after King is assassinated, where he's out on the golf course in the Far East, that it's a terrible thing, but he doesn't express too much remorse about it. And so these evangelical icons like Graham and others are set up in a way to show morality. They are set up in a way in which we have to start to think about the ways in which moral issues are used. But the most important part about this book, I think, is to show people that it's not just abortion that drives evangelicals. What really has driven evangelicals about their political activity has not been abortion, but it is race. And if we go back to look at Bob Jones University and the tax-exempt status of that university that got stripped away because they would not embrace interracial times for people to come to this church, I think it's really important for us to understand that the story that we have about modern day right-wing conservatives, however you want to call them these days, is not just about moral issues, but the moral issues that were used to prop up the real issue that was behind everything, which was race. And so the embrace of Ronald Reagan, the embrace of the moral majority was in part to show how they would use their moral issues as a way to hide behind the kinds of racial world that they wanted. And so you might be asking yourself, if you know a little bit about evangelical history, well, what about the racial reconciliation movement of the mid to late 1990s and beyond? What I think my book shows is that these racial reconciliation movements are merely window dressing. They are designed to bring people into the fold, for whites to be able to speak about their so-called racism in safe, comforting spaces where they can take this on as an individual sin rather than a corporate sin, rather than the ways in which you can think about racism as being structural and not just because of individual sin. And so when we start to talk about issues like the Southern Baptists, or we talk about the large Pentecostal racial reconciliation that happened in 1994 that changed one Pentecostal organization into another, or we talk about things like the Promise Keepers, what we have to keep in mind is the ways in which these organizations were used to not only get people racially together or to integrate, but it was also to draw African Americans and people of other ethnic groups into a certain kind of voting. And that voting was with the Republican Party. And so when you see the rise of George Bush coming in, and George Bush's ability, not so much in 2000, but in 2004, to draw from African Americans to vote in places like Ohio and others, this compassionate conservatism that Bush latches onto becomes very important to do a pseudo kind of racial reconciliation, but at the same time to have the same racism that had always been there to be used within the evangelical movement. So now, having set this up, I want to talk a little bit about what was really important for me in writing this book, and that was the years from Obama, 2008, 2007, and beyond. And the first thing I want to show is this imagery of former President Obama. In 2008, there were a couple of things that happened that really made this intersection of morality and race become very large in evangelical world in terms of politics. As you remember, as some of you might remember, not everybody does, people were not so thrilled in evangelical world with John McCain. And it was only until he picked Sarah Palin, who was actually tagged as an evangelical, but was really a Pentecostal, that the whole movement began to pick up steam in a way. And in August of 2008, there was a political commercial that the McCain campaign put out called The One, in which they tried to frame Obama as the Antichrist. And so what began to pick up and appear during this time period was these images of Obama as the devil, the Obama as being, part of the Illuminati, as it were. You can see this saying Beast Obama and other things. And this was happening right at the same time that the rise of birtherism was beginning, where people said that he wasn't really American, but he was a Muslim. And Sarah Palin weaponized this. And I think that we need to pay attention to Sarah Palin as somebody who is a pivotal figure in evangelical political history, because what she does is she synthesizes all of this and brings this racism together, because A, she is a white woman. She is deployed in the same manner in which people deploy white women in the 19th century in terms of purity and morality, to stand up against the Black man who becomes president. And you'll probably remember all of the Tea Party and everything else. Now, my book, and specifically for a reason, stops with the beginning of Trump. And the reason why I do that is, in part, what my book is intended to show is that the racism and evangelicalism was already there even before Donald Trump. Donald Trump simply weaponized what was already there. That's number one. Number two, the other thing that Donald Trump did that was very interesting was that he didn't go for the kind of mainline Calvinist kinds of evangelicals, but he went for Pentecostals. He went for prosperity gospel people. He went for people who I used to call the D list of evangelicalism, evangelicals who were there because they had the same kinds of beliefs, but they were not the prominent evangelicals. But they too had moral issues in which they were embedded in and committed to, but they had interracialism. And the interracialism was a kind of a different interracialism than what the Southern Baptists and others wanted. It was interracialism in terms of services, in terms of the ways that they worshiped and all of these other things. But at the same time, the same kinds of racist principles were working underneath in terms of morality and ethics and all of these things. So that brings us up to what has happened a few weeks ago with the Capitol insurrection. And I just want to talk about this briefly, because this is where you can begin to see this fusion coming together of evangelicalism, the kinds of evangelicals that Trump picked up, and this kind of weaponization. One of the things that has not been spoken about very much, and I think that there'll be something that I write about pretty soon, is the ways in which evangelical language borrowed Pentecostal language of warfare and fighting spiritual battles and dominionism in order to prepare people to fight for Donald Trump. And so you'll see here, this Washington, D.C. 12/12/20 was the Jericho March, Let the Church Roar. Now, a Jericho March is what, if you know your Old Testament scripture, your Hebrew Bible, that is a march that was done around the city of Jericho to make the walls fall. Evangelicals, Pentecostals, and other kinds of religious groups all picked up on this imagery of the Jericho March and talked about how the walls needed to come down to fight this, this fake election, to fight the election had been stolen for Donald Trump. And so while this was a religiously based march, you can see below where they say March for Trump, to demand transparency and protect election integrity. These two things together, marrying the religious with the so-called political, made this march become a very important piece to what would happen on January 6th Epiphany. And here on the other side, you see a man holding a cross, and this was outside of the Capitol. This image is not that far away from the gallows that was set up in terms of this. One of the things I find very interesting, and I'll leave this for the end comments, and people can ask me all kinds of questions that you want in the chat, are the ways in which this insurrection that happened on January 6th really have a lot of antecedents in the history that I've written about evangelicals and racism and white evangelical racism. The book is titled White Evangelical Racism because, as you know, there are Asian evangelicals, there's Black evangelicals, there's evangelical Latinx evangelicals, but this is about a specific kind of evangelicalism, the kind of evangelicalism that uplifts whiteness in the service of promoting morality and subjugating other people underneath that morality to make them be in control to white patriarchy and white supremacy. And I can't say it any clearer than that. This battle at the Capitol was a battle for the soul of America, as you heard. And these things get couched in religious terms. And so when you hear Christians right now, and especially evangelical Christians, talking about Christian nationalism, it's white Christian nationalism. It's not just about Christian nationalism. It is about a certain kind of Christian nationalism that they don't want to associate themselves with, but it's in every last one of their churches. Most churches now have an American flag and a Christian flag in them. A lot of these things, the sacralization of the 4th of July, the call to patriotism, all of these kinds of calls that evangelicals have used before as moral suasion to bring people to their side, have also been weaponized by Donald Trump in order to create an army of people who tried to take over the Capitol and bring him back into power. And so when you begin to see all these people trying to revamp their prophecies, to retell the story, to say that Donald Trump is coming back, these are all embedded in religious stories. And in order to understand those stories, we have to understand the history of evangelicalism and race in America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Butler. Sounds like a wonderful book. I will certainly be ordering it. So next we have Dr. Khyati Joshi. She is Professor of Education at Farleigh Dickinson University. She's a social science researcher whose work focuses on the intersections of race and religion in the United States. Her books include New Roots in America's Sacred Ground, Religion, Race, and Ethnicity in Indian America, and her 2020 book, White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America. She has a PhD in social justice education from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst.
Thank you, Prema, and to the Society for having me here. Very excited to be with you all. And I think that Dr. Jones' book and then Dr. Butler talking about her new book really dovetails very nicely. They are talking about race and racism within Christian America, within evangelical America. And my book, my argument is about showing how Christianity has been involved in the construction of whiteness in America. And so they really kind of work together really well, and I'm happy to be here. I decided to write this book because for 20 years, actually, I've been writing and thinking about Christian privilege and white Christian privilege. And in the book, sometimes I'm talking Christian privilege and sometimes I'm talking white Christian privilege, and I try to be pretty accurate with my language. The book started out as an explanation. I actually started it back in 2012. And like Professor Butler, I really didn't want to make it about post-2016 because there's a lot of other stuff to talk about and learn about, actually, that we need to learn and we aren't learning, both in K through 12 and in higher education. So I'm really, when we're talking privilege, it's really a lot about making the invisible visible, right? When you bring up the term privilege, people usually have this very negative, visceral reaction. If we're talking white privilege, it pisses off white folks. Sorry, I know, not very academic term, but it's real. And when you bring up Christian privilege, boy, that really also affects people in a way that's, people can't always articulate, but it hits them. So one of the best ways to show where privilege comes from is history and law. So I do spend a couple of chapters talking history and law, talking about the intersections of race and religion vis-a-vis what has happened with Native Americans, what happened with African Americans, and then one chapter I spend on immigration and citizenship, showing how Christianity, along with whiteness, have been part of the legal infrastructure when it comes to immigration. I talk about citizenship and bring up some of the court cases. Actually, I begin the conversation on citizenship with President Obama, because we can really look at, in terms of the birther movement, what was going on with him, but his father being from Kenya, growing up partially in Southeast Asia. Yes, he was Christian, but he was not Christian in the way that white Christians were familiar, coming from the Black church and liberation theology, and everything that happened with Pastor Jeremiah Wright. Right, so he actually provided a great way to talk even historically about citizenship. Then I also spend some time in the book talking about how some of our really preeminent and well-known Supreme Court cases around free, especially with free exercise, really show us and highlight the Christian hegemony and normativity present in the decision. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The fact when we talk about when court rulings come out and talk about and use the phrase facially neutral, that the face of facially neutral is actually white and Christian, right? And we have to be able to see that and unpack that. Then I have one chapter that focuses on everyday Christian privilege, I call it, and I analyze the kind of internal and external dimensions of privilege to help folks go deeper. I've really written this book for students and graduate students and for everyday folks to understand. It's filled with stories, stories from my students, a few family personal stories, and then, you know, stories that really come from data also. I think it's important to understand the impact of this information and the impact of Christian privilege on Christians, as well as humanist, atheist, and religious minorities, because that's how we see it kind of operationalized in the world. And I'm an educator in the School of Education. I work with teachers, administrators. I actually work with public policy folks also, and judges. So I'm really interested in, like, well, what's the impact of this? And I'm so thankful to all the data PRR provides and other institutes and all the historians and American religious historians and you know, folks out of psychology. This really truly is an interdisciplinary project, which those of you who do interdisciplinary work know that it can be a little scary because you're probably not getting every little corner of information totally accurate, but I've tried. If you find something that you feel is inaccurately portrayed, please let me know. But then I want to end the book, and I end the book with what do we do? How do we move forward? How do we build a better America? And I provide a roadmap, five things to reconsider. Right, and I'm not going to go through all of those. I want to share with you a little bit of my a conceptual framework so that you have an understanding of where I'm coming from. So this is the book, and my goal in writing this is highlighting what's been invisible and making it visible and how we work for justice. That's why I'm in it. And this is where you can find me on social media. So this is where how I make sense. Real quick, racism, right? A system of advantages. Actually, let me do it this way. Racism, we have a system of advantages and disadvantages based on race. Very quick definition. So similarly, we have religious oppression, where we have Christian privilege, and then the disadvantages in terms of humanist, atheist, religious minorities, as I talked about. Anti-Semitism is a form of religious oppression, right? Islamophobia, although some people don't like that term, a form of religious oppression. And then in the book, all throughout the book, I really tackle this at the institutional level, at the societal cultural level, and at the individual level, right? And specifically when I get into it there, I talk about Christian hegemony really being at the institutional level, Christian normativity at the cultural societal level, right? The normative is very powerful. And the normative is insidious. It's everywhere. It's in the ether. It's in the nooks and crannies of life. It is what allows the Christian way to be seen as the normal way of doing things, you know? And then Christian privilege really at the individual level, okay? And then you see I have this arc here, and above it, white Christian supremacy, because while African-American Christians may have Christian privilege and Asian Americans may have Christian privilege, race impacts everything, and the overarching power there is of white Christian supremacy. And that is, that's why I said sometimes I'm talking Christian privilege and sometimes I'm talking white Christian privilege. So what does this kind of specifically look like? So this is one of my most favorite images, right? If an oil company destroyed this burial ground, everyone would lose their minds. But if they destroy Native American burial grounds, no one says a word, right? The idea of this is sacred, meaning the cemetery, but land and nature and trees and rivers are not sacred in the Protestant Christian world, usually in the Christian world. And so it's not given that reverence, right? And so we'll build these pipelines and destroy sacred land. And I talk about this other forms of Christian privilege in terms of worship, where houses of worship can go up and where they can't, even if land has been zoned for houses of worship. Issues of architectural norms come up. What's the image of God? When we talk about God, sometimes there is no image of God for certain faiths, right? What's considered a normal way of praying, what gets othered, and issues of ritual and what's taken seriously and what's not. So that's just, a little bit about, I'm gonna stop share, a little bit about how it's done. And I just wanna end with a couple of, one story, depending on how long it takes me to tell it, to make this come alive. I had two students who were doing their internship. And in education, the students go to do their internship in elementary, middle schools, and high schools. And two of my students in the fall semester, who were Christian, went to their internship, and they had two cooperating teachers. And by the way, I'm in New Jersey, just to give this context. And the interns heard their cooperating teachers say, I don't know why those Jewish kids are kept home on those days. They're not very Jewish, right? The two students came back to me because they were taking my social justice education course, and they were like, Professor Joshi, it was around the High Holy Days with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and they're like, Professor Joshi, this is not okay, but we're told we shouldn't say anything because of course we want a job later, right? But this is problematic, yes. And I said, of course this is problematic, right? And we talked about it because, and the two teachers who were making this comment are Christian. They've internalized their dominance. They've internalized what's, their way of seeing what is religious and what is not. And then therefore they're making judgment on these students. And this is critical because when we're talking about educators or service providers, health workers, everybody, attitude comes in, right? And in all of this, we can legislate policy, but we can't legislate attitudes until we have these conversations. And so these two teachers had just decided who gets to be very Jewish and who's not, who's worthy of their time. Because when kids take off for their holidays, they're excused absences. And if they need help making up work, teachers have to stay after school or do whatever. You think those teachers were going to be really happy about staying after school to help these kids when that was the attitude they had, right? So, and I go into more detail and break it down, but kind of to provide a very real life situation. And I'll finally end with saying that this is a personal project for me as well. I didn't know it growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, but I lived at the intersections of race and religion all my life, not being Black, not being white. Nobody knew what to do with me. And then when I said I was Hindu, it was like, oh, wow, what's that? And so I didn't have the language to express what was going on. And so one of my real hopes for the book is that it provides people with the language to be able to articulate their experiences and use the book in their world. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi. I really enjoyed reading your book. We can turn now to the discussion. And I wanted to see if the panelists had any questions to ask of each other. I mean, we've been having this chat going on, and I know a lot of the questions have been asked and answered there. I've picked a few others, but I wanted to first open up the opportunity to the panelists.
Now, I just want to thank Robbie and Khyati for bringing us a really interesting way to put these three books together. I think, you know, they complement each other in some really important ways. And I was just going to ask, what is the hopeful piece for you in out of your books? What's the hopeful piece? I'll go with mine last, but I would like to hear yours first.
I guess I'll go. I think the real hopeful piece is really what I've been hearing from readers. I got an email the other day from a physician who is going, he's a general practitioner, and he's going for his board. He was going for his boards in addiction medicine. And he found the way that I talked about Christian privilege and white Christian privilege helpful in terms of rethinking addiction recovery programs and what's needed. So that's what's real hopeful for me, is people being able to use this so that we can make lives more equitable and just for all.
All right, well, I'll jump in. You know, I'll actually say that I am, so, you know, I was using 2018 data for the book, and I turned the book in a year ago last fall. So the fall of 2019 is when I kind of wrapped the book. And I'll say I'm more hopeful now than I was when I turned in the pages of the book. And here's just a couple of examples. One is I spent about 3 weeks in Richmond, Virginia, doing some kind of primary research, digging through the United Daughters of the Confederacy archives and other Virginia Historical Society archives and other things. And one of the things I would do is I would take a walk down Monument Avenue and in the shadows of these gigantic Confederate monuments. For anything who've been there, these 5 gigantic monuments on this long linear park in traffic, you know, stops and traffic circles. And around those traffic circles, by the way, are white Christian churches that literally uprooted themselves in the 1920s from downtown, rebuilt themselves around these traffic circles to be nearer the Confederate monuments in Richmond. And you know, 4 of the 5 of those at the statues at the center of those monuments are now gone. And when I was walking there just in 2019, you know, they had stood for 100 years. I mean, they were built after you know, in the early 1900s. The Lee one was 1890, but the rest of them were built after 1900. And the last one to Robert E. Lee is still, I think, being held up in court, but it's not a matter of when, but if it's going to come down. In the meantime, the one to Lee, if you saw the January cover of National Geographic, that monument to Robert E. Lee has now been turned into one of the most famous objects of performance of racial justice, pro-racial justice performance art. It made the cover of National Geographic with its projection of George Floyd onto the pedestal and BLM across the horse, Traveler, across Lee's horse Traveler, you know, there. And so I think that that's a sign, I think, of how things are changing. The one other I'll point to is my home state of Mississippi, that for the first time since 1894, in the week after the insurrection at the Capitol, for the first time at the Mississippi Capitol, a new magnolia flag rose over that state capitol that no longer has the Confederate battle flag in the Mississippi state flag. And when that was floated during last summer, during the protests over the killing of George Floyd and other African Americans by police, the Mississippi Baptist Convention actually endorsed the removal of the Confederate battle flag, and that's something they had never done. You know, there. So these are small, they're symbolic steps. And as I've written about it, and you know, I think the real challenge is whether we're going to not just tackle the symbols and the monuments, but whether we're going to tackle the culture and the theology that valorized and justified those. That's the work ahead. I think of us, whether we're going to challenge those. But I see that shifting, and I think like you, Khyati, that you know, I got an email from a 74-year-old woman, Southern Illinois, in a nearly all white town, who says, look, me and 4 other of my 70-year-old, you know, white women are standing on the corner with a Black Lives Matter sign every Saturday and Sunday in our small town, just bearing witness, you know. And so when I see those kinds of things and these kind of bigger symbols things, I am actually hopeful that the ugliness that we have in front of us and the divisiveness we have in front of us can actually be a healthy thing, because my hope is we're actually going to have this conversation, that we have just kicked down the road and pretended isn't there for centuries.
Yeah, I'm usually not a hopeful person, so my hopeful things are going to sound like they're not hopeful, but they really are. One is I'm very hopeful because of the term not the term white supremacy, but Christian nationalism coming into play, that we can start to actually talk about that. I think that has been really ignored. And with the insurrection that happened on January the 6th, those of us who've been looking at all of this for a long time realized, and it became apparent to others how much religion was a part of all of this racial, animus and violence that was happening. You saw it a little bit in Charlottesville. You've seen it in different kinds of ways, but now it is square in front of you and you cannot get away from it. So I think that's number one. That's really important. I think that what I'm hopeful about personally for my book is that I speak directly to evangelicals at the end of it. And I think that the shame that some, not all, because a lot of them don't, evangelicals feel right now after the insurrection, after Trump's loss, after these certain kinds of things in which they find themselves, sort of outside of the camp, will make some of these churches start to turn around, at least on a local level. I'm thinking about, people I personally know that are working on doing, different kinds of things to help churches get rid of their racism. So that's two. And I think the third, which is actually a political one as well, and might not seemingly have so much to do with anything that we talked about today, but I think is really important, is, the Warnock-Ossoff race in Georgia, because that awakened something that was very different, which was sort of not just the fact of seeing these two men together, but of an African-American Jewish alliance that was part of the civil rights movement that is now sort of reawakening in some different kinds of ways. And I'm anxious to see where that might go. And yeah, so that's what I'm hopeful about.
Thank you so much. So I'm looking at the questions in the Q&A because I think the questions in the chat, many of them have been answered. And there's one thread that I'd like you all to address. Several people have asked questions related to that. So we have Reese Williams, James Glenn, and then also, so basically the question is racism constitutive of white evangelicalism? So you can't separate the two, it's impossible to redeem them. And, the related question is, how does that happen? How does racism, come into these, religions or these churches? And is this true of all white evangelical? And the question is about all white evangelicals. I agree that some of them are racist, but then they're not real Christians. What about the Christian missionaries that go to Africa? Are they racist? So, I think these are all kind of interrelated questions. How does it work? And is it constitutive? Can you separate it?
Who'd like to go first?
I will go last on this one because
okay, I'll go first. I'll go first because I'm the historian here. Yes, and because you're uncomfortable and you're asking that question, it means that you know internally that this is true. I'm sorry. If you have to ask this question, then I would submit to you that you have not paid attention to the history of the United States of America. How does slavery get substantiated? The curse of Ham. Slaves did this thing. They looked at the nakedness of Abraham. That is the reason why Ham looked at Abraham's nakedness. This is why you are all enslaved. Here are the scriptures about slavery, Onesimus. Here's the scriptures in Ephesians, all this stuff. The Bible has been used to justify slavery. Number one, what do evangelicals like the most? The Bible, okay? We could take it forward from there. This is why you need to pick up my book and read it cover to cover. Not gonna try to sell it, but this is why you need to read it. That's number one. So about those missionaries in Africa, yes, racist. Because you're going to Africa because you think they're savages. And you think that they don't have a religion, and you think that you don't care about that religion because Christianity brings civilization. take my class. I break this down for a whole semester, okay? So I want to just get people out of this notion right now. Somebody else asked in the text and I answered you about why did I have to use the words white and black? That was very pejorative. Well, we don't start to talk about the ways that people look at things racially in this country, we are never going to get past the racism. I want you to hear me loud and clear. I'm not here to make you comfortable with this book. I'm here to teach you some history that is the real history of this country, and you need to understand it once and for all, and stop letting these people gaslight you with these events about racial reconciliation and everything else, when they are just ways in which to prop up white supremacists, to prop up a system that privileges white men over everybody else, and to continue the same kinds of problems that we've had. And so I think that the kinds of charts that Robbie showed you and all of these things let you know that evangelicals themselves know that they're racist. They're not trying to hide from it. What we need to do is dismantle it. That's all I'm going to say. Don't get me to start preaching.
Okay, Dr. Jones. Yes.
All right. So I'm the white guy. I'm going to follow you, Anthea, and just say, like, look, this book is the most uncomfortable thing I've ever written. It was about my family. It was about my history. I began with a revelation I didn't have until I was in my 20s. And I was that kid who went to church all the time growing up. And it wasn't until, and I was a Southern Baptist, it wasn't until I was in my 20s in seminary that I found out that our denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, was founded precisely to make enslaving other people based on the color of their skin to be compatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Like, that was the beginning of the Southern Baptist Convention. But that was hidden from me. And again, I was in every Sunday school class that was offered pretty much, unless I was sick. I was there all the time. I never heard a sermon. I never heard a Sunday school class. I never got a Bible study that tackled even our own denominational history here. And I think that is testimony to the power of how this has been hidden, I think, inside of white Christian churches. You know, when I think of King, a letter from Birmingham jail, where he's writing not to the people throwing bricks and burning crosses, he's writing to the respectable white Christian leaders in Birmingham. And he's saying, like, who are these Christians sitting so comfortably behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows, right? And I think the truth of it is that, we have to sit with this very uncomfortable history. And I think kind of let those waves wash over us a bit, because it is been so, our consciousness that really, I think, have been so anesthetized, by white Christian theology, which I think has been constructed in ways, I think, to hide, this history. And we just, frankly, never told the truth. I think in some ways where we have to go is really a simple, in terms of white Christians and white Christian institutional history, is tell the truth and love our neighbors, right? Those are two things we've never fully done. And so I think that that's kind of on the church. So I start my book with a chapter called Seeing. And the reason I start there is because of the ways this has all been rendered invisible, I think, by the stories that white Christians have told themselves about innocence and blamelessness, and frankly, a kind of arrogant approach to having a corner on biblical truth. And I think if there's one thing I'll kind of drop it here, but that I do think it's constitutive. That's part of kind of the laying out the data and the history. And I think I kind of moved, in my own journey on this, starting with a kind of questions like, oh my God, like, how can this be? When you start seeing the disturbing history and you start really seeing the disturbing present, but once you sort of get the history, that question really moves from how can this be to how could this be otherwise, when you really understand the history, right? And then and you see it played out in the contemporary public opinion data. But I think the task for us is to kind of sit with that discomfort, long enough that we're really, coming to terms with it, and not the real temptation, I think, is to let it bounce off. But I think the task in front of us is to sit with it long enough and just kind of let it sink in.
What I will add to the conversation is to say that I think, there is such an emphasis right now on looking at evangelical America, and specifically the need to look at white evangelical America, but we can't let other Christians off the hook. Straight up, right? We can't. There are many people who wouldn't identify as evangelical, but have similar views. With the work I've done, I'm really talking and trying to talk to the folks who identify with a variety of types of Christianity. Those people who are progressive, those folks who were really upset and bothered that their religion was used by 45 in June when he walked to St. John's Church and held up the Bible upside down, right? And to give the bat signal to those who were voting for Trump and behind him, right? They were bothered by that. And then let's fast forward to the Jeep Bruce Springsteen commercial. Okay, and let's fast forward to that. And lots of folks talking about the connections of Christian nationalism and white supremacy. I think Professor Butler said this earlier. It's not just Christian nationalism, it's white Christian nationalism. You have to put all three words together first. It was very interesting. There were a number of folks. So going back to the Christians who, the folks who believe in building a better America, who work for justice, who want to, are out of the Black Lives Matter protests. But the power of the norm has to be understood here. So when it comes to the Springsteen Jeep commercial, there were a lot of folks who were saying, oh, you know what that ad was about? It was about Springsteen saying, you can't, that imagery is not just yours, it's ours also. But who's that our, right? So you have folks who believe in justice, who believe in Black Lives Matter, who believe pipelines shouldn't be built through Native American land, but they can't see the power of how normative Christianity is in this country, to the point where it's invisible, right? So this idea of making it visible and giving the folks who believe in justice the language and the tools to make change is critical. So I would like to see, especially if there are journalists out there, of having broader conversations. Yes, talk about evangelicals and the power they've yielded in terms of government, especially recently and before, as Professor Butler's book is going to show. But let's not forget about the rest of Christians and, frankly, those who aren't Christian and how they're being affected, right? So my ask, especially for journalists, is a wider and broader conversation to understand the impact of all of this.
Thank you. So there's another kind of set of questions that I want to throw out. So it is about, you talked about white evangelicals, and this is kind of built in. But how about other types of evangelicals? So one person, Stephen Hu, says some Asian American Christians strongly support Trump, and someone else talked about Black conservatives. It's not even supporting Trump, but do other Christians or evangelical Christians internalize many of these ideas, or is there some way that they are able to, if they are people of color, separate the racism part? Is it even possible?
Khyati, if you want to go first, please.
Yeah, go ahead, Khyati, if you want to.
Well, what I would say is, I'm thinking of the work done by Janelle Wong on evangelicals and immigrant groups. And the one piece of data that sticks out is that certain Asian American groups, they did find where, I think it was Korean Americans, they are in line with white evangelicals when it comes to issues around gay lesbian issues. That's where you see alignment, but on other social issues, that you don't necessarily see that alignment. So that's the one piece of data I can pull up from my brain.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to realize that I came to my book in a funny kind of way. I came through it through Nigerian Christianity. I had a project in 2018, 2019, where I traveled to Nigeria because I was doing a project to look at why Nigerians were so conservative, first of all, and they loved Donald Trump, and it was prosperity gospel, Donald Trump, and religion. And I had a pastor there tell me that he was so happy that Hillary Clinton had lost because we would have had so many more abortions, and she was basically the devil, and that Donald Trump was sent by God. And I was just like sitting in Lagos with my mouth open going, okay, I have a lot of work to do here. And I tell that story because I think it's a good segue to ask, why are these groups really like, they aren't necessarily, you know, the people that you would peg to like somebody like a Trump or to be really conservative politically, but they are because of moral issues. And that's part of what my book is trying to get at, is that you need to understand that the moral issues are what carry people forward into thinking about things like civilization and what kind of civilization you want. I talk in a section of the book about the ways in which, you know, evangelicals of color are forced to take on white kinds of music and other things, because that's the way you fit in. You can't come in singing gospel music or rap music. You have to be able to conform to this whiteness that's not just also about, you know, leadership and everything else. It's about culturally, how do you dress? How do you look? How do you do your hair? How all of these things. And, you know, as somebody who used to go to evangelical churches, I know exactly what this is. And I know exactly how it works. And it works in a certain kind of way in which to conform you to not just an evangelicalism about, you know, believing the moral beliefs, but about taking on the cultural trappings and everything else around it so that you conform to this. And if we want to talk about it in a broader, more historical sense, you have to also think about the ways in which Christianity and civilization have been put together in such a way that they get deployed in a type of way so that the person who got mad at me about the missionary question doesn't understand that when you hear, you know, somebody, a Black person from Africa in 19th century say, I'm so glad Christianity came because it gave us civilization. Who tells you that? A missionary tells you that. That's the part of it that's really important. And you can replicate that, you know, in India and in other places around the world. It's the same thing.
Dr. Jones, do you have anything to say or add?
I think she covered the ground. We can maybe take another one.
Okay. I mean, I know that one of the questions that I had, and I know PRRI did this research, it was published in December, about COVID behaviors and religion of the different groups, and you know how the COVID behaviors and beliefs of white Christians are really impacting other groups, you know, which are the ones who are much more likely to come down with COVID or be affected by that. Do you want to take a few minutes to, you know, talk about that, Dr. Jones?
Sure, I can do it quickly. I mean, certainly one of the remarkable things we found in our pre-election study was on this point was white evangelicals standing out really among all religious groups. They were the only religious group that did not list the COVID-19 pandemic as a critical issue to them in the 2020 election. That's notable across the board, really outstanding. And, you know, this kind of alignment around partisanship, I think has been one of the things that we're seeing is a real challenge. I think in both taking being more likely to think that the pandemic is a hoax or not as serious as it is. But I think it's been, or trusting they were also the least likely to trust any sources of information about the pandemic, including Donald Trump. And in fact, among white evangelicals, less than 4 in 10, we gave them 8 different sources like CDC, the World Health Organization, local county health departments. None of those reached 4 in 10 in terms of trust. And I think that trust about getting accurate information about the pandemic. But I think that's because, you know, that the head of the Republican Party, Trump, that evangelicals have been so attached to, had sown so much really kind of disinformation, misinformation about the virus that it really just muddied the waters, and that stuck all the way through the 2020.
Thank you. So there's a question for Dr. Joshi here, and Richard Semino wants to know whether, and I think this is a question for everybody, whether white Christian privilege is something distinctive, or, you know, is it, you know, is it different from majority religious privilege in, you know, like in India, Hinduism in India, Judaism in Israel, Buddhism in Thailand, or is there something distinctive about white Christian privilege, or is it just the fact that this is a majority privilege, religious privilege?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So a couple of things. The real foundation of my book is guided by the work of Paulo Freire, who wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. who was a Brazilian educator who worked with the masses in Sao Paulo, educating folks who most people believe couldn't be educated. And he talks about the oppressed and the oppressor. Folks, groups that have advantage, disadvantage is another way we can talk about that. So it speaks to me, that conceptual framework speaks to me for a variety of different reasons, including what you bring up, which is how can we think about these issues in other countries? Now, in one sense, India is a good analogy to talk about what we're talking about right now in terms of the United States. However, Israel or Saudi Arabia are not, because those are not secular countries, right? They have an official state religion. So I do think you have to make sure we're talking apples to maybe red apples to green apples, because they're not even exactly alike, because there's the issue of colonialism. The C in colonialism also stands for Christianity. The two have gone hand in hand in most cases. And so we certainly can apply that framework if we're talking about Christian privilege in the United States. Do we talk about Hindu privilege in India? Absolutely. I'm an Americanist, so I'm more familiar with what's here, don't know the laws and all that exist in India, but what I can say is when I go to India, you better believe it, I have Hindu privilege. So that's for another, to be continued in another conversation.
Do either Dr. Butler, Dr. Jones, do you have any thoughts? Do you want to add anything to that?
I'm good.
I think I do.
I think we can move on.
Okay, so there is a question for Dr. Butler and from Wes King, and he says, you briefly touched on patriarchy. What are the implications of your work for LGBTQ Christians?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of implications, because I think once we realize the racism, you also have to understand the inherent sexism that goes within that, and the ideas about heteronormativity that are at play in evangelicalism because of the fear, right? And the fear of not having this nuclear family, the fear of having other kinds of sexual lives, basically. And I think what's important in this particular case is that if you see that morality is actually a shield for what they're doing, then you can understand how many of these pastors and everybody else end up making the mess that they do. I'm thinking right now about Ted Haggard, who had, a spectacular fall after being the president of the National Association of Evangelicals. And he was found out that he was actually seeing a man on the side in Denver, Colorado, while he was doing that. Or you can think about the recent story that just came out yesterday, I believe it was, in Christianity Today and the Washington Post about Ravi Zacharias, who basically was like, raping women and getting naked pictures and coercing people at massage parlors and the spas that he owned all around the world. And so I think, if you want to read a good book that I think helps to understand this male sort of centered piece, I would suggest that you read Kristen Kobes-Dumez's book, Jesus and John Wayne. I think that's an excellent book to kind of think about that. I'll finally say this. One of the things that I've been really concerned about on a personal level is Black churches and, the rampant pushback against, anybody who was gay or lesbian or trans or anything like that. And I think that part of that has to do with this embrace of these, moral values that supposedly give you a certain kind of holiness or whatever. And I think that some of that is really beginning to start to be dismantled. But I think that also talking about race in relationship to sexuality and racism really will help this move forward and to start to break down some of these really, I would say, awful kinds of policies and things that have happened because, evangelicals have promoted them.
Thank you. And here's a question for Dr. Jones from Dr. Ryan Cragen. So he says, you found that white evangelicals who attend religious services more frequently are also more racist than those who attend less frequently. Any thoughts on the causal direction here? And someone else pointed out that basically you're saying that the non-religious ones are the ones who are more moral or have better morals than those who are religious.
Yeah, it is stunning. I mean, what the data suggests, one way to kind of boil it down, so if you take your average white American and you add Christianity, they move up the scale in terms of holding more racist attitudes. So on this thing about religious services in particular, I think the best way to understand it is cyclical. It's really almost impossible to sort out the arrow going one direction or the other. But if you think about this, I mean, what the thing that institutions do, right, is they embody values and they hand them down to the next generation. Like that's the job of a religious institution, right? Is kind of be a transgenerational vehicle of kind of handing values down and preserving them. And so, I think, what it means is that, we are born into these institutions that inherit a kind of white supremacist set of values behind them that inculcate it into the next generation. And then the next generation, unless it has some critical distance from it, in turn kind of, justifies it, props it up, and hands it down again. I mean, one of the more remarkable pieces I'll cite real quickly is exactly a book called Deep Roots that was a group of Stanford political scientists that looked at slaveholding levels in 1860 and were able to show that the levels of slaveholding in 1860 are predictive of white attitudes today using CCES data and controlling for all kinds of potentially intervening variables. They're less likely to affirm affirmative action. They're less likely to be Democrats. There's and more likely to oppose civil rights. So I mean, and they were able to show it very, very rigorously there. And I think it's a good thing to the power of institutions. So I really do think it's a cyclical thing. And the question is how to break the cycle. I think really is what we're really talking about here, so that it just doesn't perpetuate itself. And I guess the last thing to say is that the most dangerous thing I think is to say if you're Christian you can't be racist, right? That's probably the most counterfactual statement you could ever utter from a historical perspective. And so I think the real question is the only way to say something like that is to say that's not the best form of Christianity we would hope to see in the world, right? But you certainly can't say that's not the form of Christianity that has been in the world, and certainly in the American context. And so the question is, how do you narrow that gap between the Christianity that we have that has clearly been wrapped up and is the dominant, really it's the dominant moral force, right, in power in U.S. history. And so you don't get slavery, you don't get Jim Crow, you don't get the kinds of inequalities we have in front of us today without the kind of largest power base, and that is kind of white Christian churches and denominations shoring that up, right, as a morally justifiable way to organize society.
And can I just add one thing to the end of what Robert said? You don't get the violence either. And the violence is part and parcel of American Christianity. And we try to pretend that violence is not real and that it didn't happen, but the insurrection put that on display for hours. And lots of those people were hollering about Jesus and praying right there in the Senate chambers. So, And
minute 5 of the House Manager video they displayed on day 1, there's a giant white cross and a big sign that says, "Jesus, I trust you." Right, among the Confederate flags and the white supremacist flags intermixed.
So I think maybe we'll just take one more question, and hopefully this will be quick. So Anne Swanson wants to know whether there's any connection between what is the impact of QAnon on white Christian nationalism, if that's something that
You got another hour? Yes. Yes and yes. I mean, This is a whole nother thing that we could do, and it's not just on white Christian nationalism. It's on groups of evangelicals. This kind of conspiracy theory, sort of latent movement with prophecies and predictions and all these kinds of things fit very neatly into Christian nationalism. In part because they're all predictions about what's supposed to happen with America, and that's all tied in with Donald Trump. And I don't know how to say it any clearer than that without going into a whole soliloquy about what Q is about.
Right.
Yeah, just one quick add-on on that. Just I think if you boil all this down, it really is about who is America and who owns America, right? And those assertions of power and ownership. And when you hear phrases like we heard on January 6th from Trump and throughout really his campaign and presidency, like, if you don't act now, America as you know it will be over, right? I mean, that's a pretty straight up, reference to a kind of white Christian power base and who, and really, I mean, especially white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, have throughout history thought of themselves as the country, right? And I think having to let go of that conception is part of the piece. And I mean, really, I mean, the only way to say it is that that people seem to be losing their damn minds, right? Is because they're faced finally with giving up, this privileged position of power in the country and needing to share it with others.
And what I would add is that, yes, I think we could talk about this definitely for another hour, is really this whole conversation about, well, what does it mean to give up privilege? That's often a source of, a discussion that happens in my classes, and we think about privilege as pie, but privilege isn't pie. I mean, I'll leave it there. I say more in the book and talk, and kind of walk through that. But I think the other thing is to, everyone needs to understand how, for example, how our immigration laws in the 1920s, going back to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, how through immigration laws, we socially engineered tried to socially engineer a certain kind of America, the kind of America that I grew up seeing in Leave It to Beaver and Andy Griffith, right? But that was socially engineered, folks. And teaching that and folks knowing about it is critical. I think that's one of the only other ways we're really going to make change. I want to just add also, because I know we're coming up on 4 o'clock, if I can make a real quick plug, and I'll put this in the chat, 2 study guides have been developed for white Christian privilege, one for ethnic studies, religious studies, and then one for law and legal studies. So in case that can be helpful, it's out there and it's free. And yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a fabulous panel. You can see from the chat, so many people have complimented you all, the panelists. Thank you very much for taking the time for being with us. And for the questions, yes, this is being recorded. It will be made available on our website later. So please join us in March 12th, and again on April 9th for 2 more pre-conference sessions. Thank you again.
Thanks.